He was just a number. Lot 21, quiet, lame, forgotten. A wild bobcat, caged in a rusted crate at the darkest corner of an illegal auction camp, where creatures once belonging to lush forests were sold off like worn-out goods no one cared to look at twice. No more growling, no more thrashing. The bobcat simply lay there, eyes that neither searched nor hoped nor resisted, as if he had learned to wait in hopelessness, as if, deep within his mind, the world had given up on him long ago. Above the cage hung a dangling metal tag. Lot 21, male, injured. Unknown origin. The auctioneer's voice droned on, emotionless. Lot 21, $200. Anyone? No one looked up. No hands raised. No one wanted a creature already crippled and drained. Until a man walked in. His name was Jonah Walker, in his early 40s. Sleeves rolled up, grease stains still smudged on his cuffs. He worked at the docks, repairing old fishing boats, and had never had a reason to step foot into a place like this. But this afternoon, for some reason, he'd pulled over, then stepped in. Jonah stood at the doorway, his eyes scanning the cramped cages. The surrounding noise faded as he caught sight of the bobcat in the farthest corner, the look of a creature that expected nothing anymore. And then, for just a split second, those faded amber eyes lifted. There was no hope, only recognition, a kind of familiar pain. Jonah felt his chest tighten. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the utter silence in those eyes, a silence that needed no language. Maybe it was because the animal asked for nothing, didn't cry, didn't whimper, just waited, as if already used to being passed over by fate. And in that moment, his hand went up. Instinctively, before his own mind could ask, "What the hell are you doing, Jonah?" $200. Going once? Twice? No one else? Sold. To the man in the back. No applause, no attention, just the scratch of a pen on paper, and a receipt passed without a glance exchanged. Jonah walked toward the cage, his hand trembling slightly as he unlocked it. The bobcat didn't flinch, didn't growl, didn't startle. He stood, limping from an old wound, and quietly followed Jonah outside as if he'd walked that path before, in another life. The evening wind swept dust across the cracked earth. Jonah opened the passenger door. The bobcat hesitated for a moment, then climbed in, curling up on the floor without a sound. Jonah got in, but didn't start the engine right away. He looked at the animal beside him, now just a weary silhouette. He hadn't meant to save anyone. But as the engine roared to life in that desolate lot, he suddenly realized he wasn't the savior. He was the one being saved. The truck rolled forward, tires crunching over gravel and years gone by. Inside, neither man nor bobcat spoke. Jonah drove with one hand, the other near the gear shift, his eyes occasionally stealing glances at the space by the passenger seat. The bobcat lay curled up, not asleep, not at peace, just still. Each bump in the road made his body tense. Each breeze through the cracked window made his ears twitch, but he didn't look at Jonah, not once. And in that silence, something began. Not trust, not friendship, just two wounds placed next to each other by accident. But he didn't look at Jonah, not once. The road stretched out beneath a pale gray sky, eerily still. Jonah had always found peace in driving, the hum of the engine, the scenery sliding past like a wordless dream. But today, something pressed down on the air. Not quite regret, but close. Something unnamed. He hadn't planned to bring home a bobcat, especially not one with darkness in his eyes, a darkness Jonah knew too well. And though he told himself this was all a fluke, a whim, deep down, Jonah knew it wasn't, couldn't be. Perhaps somewhere they were meant to find each other. He muttered, more to himself than to the animal, "You got a name?" The bobcat didn't move. "No, figured." He sighed, scratching his chin. "How about Buddy?" "Max." "Scout?" Silence. Jonah hesitated, then said one more name, a name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Shadow. At that moment, the bobcat's ears twitched, barely, but enough to make Jonah freeze. He whispered it again, voice brushing against memory. "Shadow." The bobcat lifted his head, just slightly, enough for his eyes to pass over Jonah for the briefest second. The moment passed in a blink, but something cracked open in Jonah's chest. A memory rushed in, the smell of scorched sand, gun smoke, screams, and a dog, also named Shadow, pressed close to him, body bloodied and trembling but refusing to leave, staying until the medics came. That dog never made it back, but the name had lived on inside Jonah like a scar that never healed. By the time they reached the old house on the edge of a barren field, Jonah felt drained in a way he couldn't explain. He parked, stepped out, and opened the passenger door. "Come on." Shadow, now bearing that name, paused, then stood. He didn't leap out, didn't sniff curiously, just stepped down, as if obeying an ancient command from a place long lost. Jonah led him up the porch steps, opened the creaking screen door, and nodded him inside. The bobcat entered without a sound. No tail flick, no growl, no hesitation. He moved through the unfamiliar house, as if he'd lived there before, as if everything had already been written. Jonah grabbed a towel, gently wiped his paws. The pads were cracked, bleeding slightly. He didn't resist, didn't pull away, just stared at the floor, eyes hollow as a ravine. Jonah laid out an old blanket by the fireplace, poured water into a bowl, and opened a can of meat. Shadow sniffed, but didn't eat. He simply curled up on the blanket, eyes closed, as if the world behind him had worn him down beyond remembering. That night, Jonah didn't sleep in his room. He lay on the long chair facing the hearth, the fire casting a dim orange hue across the faded wooden walls. He couldn't shake the image of the torn ear, the limp, and that subtle twitch of the ears when it heard that name. Sleep came in broken fragments, explosions, screams, blood, wind blowing sand into his eyes, and fear screaming in his ears. Around 3 a.m., Jonah jolted awake, breathing hard, sweat soaking his back, and he saw it, Shadow, sitting upright across the room. Its eyes gleamed in the dark, not alert, not afraid, just seeing him. No one spoke. But in that silence, something shifted. A memory that needed no words. An understanding only those who've lived through darkness could recognize. From that day on, the days passed like fog, slow, heavy, and quiet. Shadow never left the porch. It lay on the old wooden planks, head resting on its front paws, eyes fixed on the distant tree line. Even when birds darted across branches, even when cars rushed by the dusty road behind, it didn't flinch. It was like a sentry, trapped between instinct and memory. Jonah watched from the window, coffee growing cold in his hand. He wasn't sure whether Shadow was protecting something or waiting for something to return. Jonah had tried everything to spark a response in the bobcat. Toys, fresh meat, long walks through the woods behind the house, but it didn't react like other wild animals. No curiosity, no growls, no exploring, just moved, slowly, deliberately, as if carrying out a familiar mission. It turned before Jonah even thought to shift the wheel. It stopped at doorways like it was clearing the zone, always scanning the horizon, always silent like a ghost guarding something nameless. Whatever Shadow's past was, it had never let go of him. And maybe it never would. The old collar still hung loosely around its neck. The leather faded, threads fraying. One night, Jonah gave in to a quiet, gnawing curiosity. He sat beside it on the porch steps and gently turned the inside of the collar. Beneath the dirt and dust, something metallic, dented and almost unreadable. A string of numbers. A chip code. Someone had tried to scratch it off, to hide it. That very night, Jonah drove across town to find a woman named Helen, a retired vet tech living on a small farm at the edge of the woods, surrounded by abandoned animals and unfinished paintings. She didn't ask much, and that was exactly what Jonah needed. Under her old scanner, the chip flickered weakly. The system took longer than usual, but finally, something came up. A name, a fragment of history. Helen repeated it softly, as if to herself. Its name is Sarge. She skimmed the file. Owner field, private, unlisted. Jonah said nothing. But the next morning's wind felt different, sharper, colder, as if winter was trying to say something. Ever since that call from the journalist, Margot Lane, Jonah had felt the thin line between truth and shadow beginning to split open. She hadn't said much, but the way she spoke, brief, steady, like carrying something heavy, made it clear she knew exactly what was hidden behind that word classified. That morning, Jonah walked across the yard with a cup of black coffee while Shadow began his daily patrol. He moved from point to point, never missing a step, never lingering too long. Jonah never trained him. Didn't need to. It was all already in him, deep, very deep. But this wasn't just habit. This was defense. This was a survival instinct. This was fear, encoded into reflex. That afternoon, Jonah opened an old contact list, numbers he'd avoided for years. He called Ben Claremont, a former intelligence colonel, one of the few people who still owed him a promise. They met at a quiet bar on the edge of town, where people asked few questions and remembered even less. Ben arrived in an old windbreaker, hands in his pockets, eyes still sharp as they were in briefing rooms. Jonah slid the number from the chip across the table. "Where'd you find it?" Ben asked. "Inside the collar of a bobcat." Ben frowned. "A bobcat? From where?" "An illegal sale yard. I didn't go looking, but it felt like it found me." Ben didn't touch the paper, just stared at it. For a long time. Then he said softly, "There are some contracts not filed under government records." "What do you mean?" "There are operations, born to be forgotten, and if that animal was involved, someone tried hard to erase it. Bobcats don't just end up on rural black markets, not ones like that." That night, Jonah didn't sleep. Couldn't. As always, Shadow lay across the front door, between him and the world outside. Around 2 a.m., Jonah sat at the kitchen table, flipping through old notes, trying to piece meaning from forgotten fragments. Suddenly, a sound. Shadow rose instantly. A low growl, deep and drawn out, like it echoed from the bottom of a ravine. A sound Jonah had never heard from him before. Not a threat, not reflex, a warning. Jonah froze. The entire body is locking up. That familiar sensation rose in his chest, the one all survivors recognize. Something's not right. That growl wasn't for show. Shadow stood upright, body taut like a drawn bow, eyes locked on the front window. Jonah quietly stepped beside him, gently pulling back the curtain. Across the misty field, a black sedan sat still. No lights, no movement, just silence. Then slowly, the car backed away, not hurried, not loud, and vanished into the night. Shadow didn't look away. Not for a long time. Jonah felt his heartbeat in his throat. An old feeling surged back, The kind that tells you someone just measured your threshold, didn't cross it, but touched it. He locked every door, rechecked every window. Someone had been there, had stood out there, and left. But why? Why now? The next morning, Jonah said nothing. He simply gathered Shadow's blanket and laid it beside his own bed. No more distance, no more doors between them. Shadow didn't protest. He curled at the foot of the bed as if he'd been waiting for it all along. And something inside Jonah shifted too. This was no longer just a story about an abandoned animal. This was a fragment of connection, a warning, a piece of the past that neither of them could bury any deeper. Whatever had happened to Shadow in that distant desert, whoever had tried to erase the trail, they had failed. Because Jonah now knew, and he had no intention of stopping. That week, the seasons turned abruptly. Cold winds swept in, frosting the entire town. Each morning, Jonah rose before dawn, his breath misting in the pale light. And every morning, Shadow was already waiting at the door. Standing alert, ears upright, eyes fixed on the horizon. They lived like a quiet clock. Wordless walks, long drives to nowhere. Meals are shared in silence. The quiet between them became sacred. No need to speak, still understood. But beneath that fog, something inside Jonah stirred. Memories. Not images, but a hovering pressure. Not noise, but the weight of prolonged silence. The nightmares returned. Deeper, more vivid. Fire, explosions, blood in the sand. And the last time Jonah saw the first shadow, a military dog by the same name, racing through smoke, then vanishing in a scream no one heard. He had buried those memories under heavy labor and long silence. But now, with this new bobcat, also named Shadow, they were seeping back through the cracks of sleepless nights. That day, after a long, frigid walk through the woods, Jonah dragged himself inside, collapsed into the old chair, and reached for the painkillers. He'd stopped using them for a while. But the cold and the memories brought everything aching back. He took 2 pills and closed his eyes. Across the road, old Mrs. Margaret, his elderly neighbor, had just slipped behind her garden. She fell near the back gate, arms too weak to lift herself. The frost soaked through her clothes, biting into her skin. She tried to call out, but her voice was no more than a whisper in the wind. No one heard, except Shadow. He shot up from the foot of the bed. Not a sound, but something had awakened in him, a primal instinct, not triggered by noise, but by duty. Shadow growled low, deep, a rumble from the earth's core. Jonah didn't hear, still numbed by exhaustion and medication. And then Shadow did something he had never done before. He lunged through the door, the mesh screen tore under his weight, and he sprinted into the night. Jonah woke to a sharp, urgent barking, furious, relentless. He stumbled up, heart pounding like a war drum. Grabbing the flashlight, he rushed across the yard, beam shaking in his hand. The sight stopped him cold. Shadow stood beside Margaret's frail body, motionless, her face pale, lips blue. He barked non-stop, licked her cheeks, trying to draw back the last remaining warmth. Jonah dropped to his knees, checked her pulse. Faint, but still there. He called for an ambulance. His hands were freezing, but he held her wrinkled hand tight until red lights flickered through the fence. The paramedics arrived just in time. Barely. The doctor said a few minutes more, and she would not have made it. But she lived. Because Shadow had heard the whisper that no one else did, and ran as if it were the final command of his life. Had he been just minutes later, Margaret would have died. The next day, the local paper ran a tiny headline at the bottom of the last page. Bobcat saves elderly woman, a strange tale from the outskirts. The reporter was Margot Lane, the same journalist who had called Jonah about Shadow, but this time she brought no questions about classified files. She didn't mention private camps or buried contracts. She came with a photograph. Old, blurry, probably taken 5 or 6 years ago. A young man in desert fatigues, kneeling beside a bobcat, one that looked exactly like Shadow. Behind them, barbed wire fencing, sun-scorched sand, and the shadows of armed guards. Beneath the photo, a torn caption. Only one name remained, Logan Price. Margot gently tapped the name. This man went missing. The official report said KIA, killed in action, 3 years ago, but his body was never recovered. The last person to see him alive said he always had a bobcat with him, one just like yours. Jonah said nothing for a long time, but something inside him began to unravel. Confusion, anger, suspicion flooding in. If this were true, if Logan wasn't dead and Shadow had once belonged to him, then this wasn't just about a bobcat abandoned. It was the story of a soldier who vanished, a mission buried, a truth strangled in silence. Jonah looked down at Shadow, sitting close by his feet, tail still, eyes fixed on the door as if waiting for someone to walk through. There were still things left untold. And the trail wasn't cold yet. It wasn't time to stop. The next morning, a thin mist still clung to the window glass like a warning. Jonah woke early, but Shadow was already at the door, body tense, ears sharp, gaze wary. Jonah opened the door slowly, hoping it was only the cold wind. But right there on the porch, half hidden beneath the doormat, lay a white envelope. No stamp, no name, no address. Not something sent, something placed. Jonah stood still, then bent down to pick it up. His hand felt colder than the morning air. He brought it inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened it. Inside was a photo, the same one Margot had shown him yesterday. Logan was kneeling beside Shadow in full tactical gear, but this time the photo was clearer, sharper, taken from a higher angle. It felt like surveillance. On the back of the photo, scrawled in black ink, were the words, "Not every one of them gets to come back." That was it. Nothing else. Jonah sat frozen, heart pounding against his chest. He felt cold, not because of the weather, but because someone knew who he was, knew Shadow was here, and knew exactly what they were searching for. This wasn't just a photo. It was a reminder, a warning, the dark knocking at the door. That afternoon, Jonah drove into town like any other day. He stopped at the store, lingered longer than necessary, and tried to act as normal as possible. Didn't look around, didn't rush. But every step felt like a stone in his shoes. When he returned and stepped onto the porch, he froze. The front door was ajar. Barely. Just enough to know it hadn't been locked from the inside. Jonah's heart seized. He stepped inside, every footfall cautious. Drawers were yanked open, papers scattered. Nothing valuable had been taken, but one thing was gone. Shadow's old collar. The one Jonah had removed weeks ago. The one with the chip code. The only piece of evidence linking Shadow to a past someone was desperate to erase. He called Margot immediately. She picked up on the second ring. "They've been here," Jonah said, voice low. He told her everything, the photo, the message, the break-in. There was a pause on the other end. Then Margot whispered, "Jonah, you may be in deeper than you think." She promised to keep digging. But Jonah knew no further confirmation was needed. the shadow was already following them. From that day on, the house became a fortress built from fear. Every footstep is cautious, every night stretched tight as a wire. But in that silence, something else grew. Between Jonah and Shadow, there was no longer suspicion. There was trust, no commands, no calls. Shadow was always beside him, as if he had become a part of Jonah himself. And in the soft flicker of firelight each night, as Jonah sipped bitter coffee, Shadow would simply rest his head on Jonah's leg and close his eyes. No barking, no trembling. As if finally he knew what safety felt like. Jonah kept the fire low, and the doors were always locked. He only left the house when absolutely necessary, to fetch water from the stream or retrieve long-forgotten canned food from the dusty basement. The fear hadn't vanished. It still lingered, like a chill trapped beneath the wooden floor. But amidst that silence, something else was forming. Something deeper than instinct, deeper than vigilance. Trust. Not the fragile kind born of illusions, but the kind forged from shared pain. From the loneliness of two beings who had once lost everything. Shadow never left Jonah's side, didn't wait for permission, didn't need to be called. He simply existed, moving from room to room like a shadow that had chosen to stay near the dimmest light. Each night, they sat by the fire's orange glow. Jonah sipped his bitter, diluted coffee. Shadow rested his head atop Jonah's boot, breathing slowly and deeply. As if, finally, he understood what it meant to be safe. On the fifth night, the call came. Margot's voice came through the static, fast and sharp like a racing heartbeat. "Jonah, I found it. You won't believe this." She sent a scanned file to his email, a bundle of old military documents full of redacted lines, pieced together from anonymous sources and leaked data. The first line, Logan Price. Next to it, a code phrase, Project Echo Watch, a covert unit, never officially acknowledged. Privately funded, operated in the gray where laws were just a facade. Attached was a photo, the first time Jonah had ever seen it. Logan, his arm in a cast, dust covering his face, was being led by a bobcat. It was Shadow. No mistake. The photo was taken in an evacuation zone covered in sand. In the lower corner, a faint caption. Date. Nearly 1 year after Logan was declared KIA. Margot's voice dropped. He didn't die. He survived. There are rumors about a handler who deserted after an ambush. Someone who knew too much. Logan might be in hiding. Jonah stared at the screen. Where would he go? "Not sure," Margot replied, "but I found something strange. Records from vet clinics across 3 states. Fake names, but the same species. Same limp and a scar beneath the left ear. Identical. The last trace is in a coastal town, about 4 hours from you." Jonah didn't wait another second. He packed a bag, started the engine. Shadow leapt into the back seat as if he already knew that this was where they needed to go, that this journey was no longer a search. It was a return. The road toward the sea stretched beneath the moonlight, windless and still. Each mile seemed to carry the past further behind. Jonah didn't know what awaited ahead. But somewhere deep in his chest, something told him Logan was still alive. And if Shadow was leading the way, then this was the answer. They arrived at dawn, just as the sun peeked over the edge of the ocean, a small, quiet town where the scent of sea salt mixed with fish oil, and fishermen didn't ask questions when strangers arrived. Jonah started with the vet clinic, then moved on to every shelter. He showed the photo, asked each person one by one. Most just shook their heads. A few hesitated. Some said he looked familiar. One boy pointed toward the harbor. "I saw that man walking along the pier a few days ago." Jonah said nothing. He turned and went. As soon as his foot touched the edge of the dock, Shadow froze. Ears up, nose twitching. Then, like lightning, he bolted, darting past stacks of fishing nets, weaving between rotting planks, until he stopped. In front of a man hunched beneath an old hooded coat. The man looked up, his face weathered by the sun, partially hidden in the slanting morning light. Jonah held his breath. His heart stopped. The man knelt down. Shadow didn't growl, didn't flinch, didn't need confirmation. He simply stepped forward and rested his head gently against the man's chest. The man trembled, hand reaching for that worn fur, and wept. When he looked up, Jonah saw everything. The pain, the recognition, and something fragile, redeemed. Jonah choked out, "Logan." The man nodded. They thought I was dead. I did too. And in that moment, all the world's noise vanished. Only two souls remained, once erased, now found. Not through gunfire or reports or medals, but through patience, through waiting, through silence. They said nothing more. They didn't need to, because by then, silence had become speech. Presence had become proof they hadn't disappeared. Jonah stood still, a few steps away, not intruding. He just let the moment carve itself into his heart. Shadow pressed into Logan's chest, no growl, no hesitation, only the shared breath of two souls, slow and complete, as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. Time, the kind that had stretched across years of voiceless waiting, seemed to rewind, collapsing the distance, answering every question no one dared ask. Shadow hadn't just found his old handler. He'd found his reason again. And Logan, sunken eyes, sunburned face, scar slashing across his temple, stood there like a man finally allowed to breathe after years buried in silence. Finally, he spoke. Voice dry as old wood. I thought I'd never see him again, or anyone. Jonah only nodded. Slow, quiet, and still. He waited, he whispered. They sat by the edge of the pier, morning light spilling softly through the rippling waves. The story came in fragments, like shattered glass pieced back together, not perfect, but enough to reveal the shape of a pain long buried. Logan told it. The ambush no one saw coming. A trap, a betrayal. His unit was left behind. Shadow dragged him, wounded, bleeding, panicked, through scorched sand and crumbling debris, never letting go. Even when the evac team arrived, even with gunfire still echoing behind them, Shadow refused to leave his side. But when Logan was airlifted out, the death certificate had already been signed. His name was struck from the list of the living, and Shadow was left behind. No one stepped up for him, Logan said, eyes never leaving the water. No one claimed the right to keep him. I couldn't go back. If I showed my face, they'd silence me. I knew too much. So he disappeared, changed his name, drifted from state to state, lived in the shadows, just watching, never interfering. Until a news article by a journalist named Margot surfaced with a name, Shadow, and a strange story about a bobcat who saved an old woman's life. Logan knew. It was time. They returned to the cabin together. This time, Logan is in the passenger seat. Shadow nestled in the middle, not like someone caught between two men, but like a bridge between two wounds, once unspeakable. They didn't say much, but the silence had softened. It held a different peace, the kind that forms when pain finally meets something it recognizes. In the weeks that followed, Margot and her editor worked relentlessly. When the exposé was published, it spread like wildfire. The battlefield Bobcat, witness to a buried truth. Social media exploded. Major news networks picked it up. Veterans from across the country sent letters. Donations poured in. Wildlife organizations, veteran support groups, and the public rallied around one thing. The truth had finally been seen. Jonah and Logan were summoned to testify before a special investigative committee on private military operations. That day, they stood side by side in a cold, echoing room. Shadow lay at their feet, older now, gray streaking his muzzle, but his eyes unchanged, alert, calm, ready. When asked why he brought Shadow home, Jonah didn't hesitate. Because I saw in him something I'd lived through myself. Logan spoke softly, almost like a thank you. He saved my life, then saved me again. When he found Jonah, the room fell silent. No one interrupted. No one objected. There was only acknowledgement, quiet but deep. A few months later, in that small coastal town, Logan opened a therapy center for veterans and animals who had been broken. Jonah helped him build it all: the rescue pens, the healing spaces, the emotional recovery classes. They named it Echo Watch, not to recall the old project that buried them, but to promise that their stories would no longer echo into silence. Shadow became the silent sentinel. He didn't have to fight anymore. He only had to be there. He touched trembling hands, lay beside nightmares too loud for words, needed no voice, no training, because his presence was enough. A reminder that healing doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from those brave enough to remember. Together, in the center's main hall, a large framed photo hangs. Logan, Jonah, Shadow, all three standing side by side, eyes facing the camera, sea wind brushing their coats. Beneath it, the caption reads, "He wasn't just saved, he saved all of us." And sometimes, at the end of the day, as the sun sinks into the sea, Shadow rises from his familiar spot, walks slowly to the gate. He doesn't howl. He doesn't growl. He simply stands there, gazing quietly toward the horizon, as if still waiting for the last one, still finding their way home.